Dear friends, thanks again for joining me today. So wonderful to see you all. Today we are going to talk about our chief destination, which is India. We are on a passage to India. And India is really in so many ways a wondrous land. It is a mystery, even to itself sometimes, and a lot has to do with the fact that it is so large and comprises so many different civilizations, as we will see. As I told you earlier, I'm going to try to deal with all of the principal religions and religious cultures that we're going to see in this journey in each particular lecture. So we looked at Buddhism in preparation for Myanmar. Now today we're going to look at Hinduism. Without understanding a little bit about Hinduism, it is almost impossible to really appreciate what India is about. And also a little bit about Jainism, because I checked, and a lot of you guys have signed up for the Karkala excursion, right? And Karkala is a major center of Jainism. So I was going to do it on my next lecture, but then I saw that we really have to do it today as part of our visit to the south of India. So that's what we're going to do today. Now, geographically, let's first take a look at this tremendous country, which is a subcontinent in itself. And as you can see, we see the same thing happening here that we saw with Myanmar. So you have the Himalayas, which form that natural barrier up north, and in the shadow, in the rain shadow of the Himalayas, we have right here the Indo-Gangetic Plains. This is where you see the main rivers, the Indus, the Ganges, and the Brahmaputra. And this, of course, is the breadbasket of the nation. Then below that, the Deccan Plateau and the Thar Desert. So you can see the core of the country is very, very, very dry, whereas up here in the north is where you can find most of the cultivation. India is the largest democracy in the world and the second most populous nation in the world after China, with 1.2 billion people. Now, there are projections that by 2020, they will bypass China and become the most populous nation in the world. It is the largest democracy. China, as we know, is not necessarily a democracy. It is a communist, one-party nation. India is an experiment in parliamentary democracy, and you know, by and large, we must give them a lot of credit, because in such an incredibly diverse nation, they are doing okay. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the challenges that they have. It's also the seventh largest economy in the world. It's amazing, because we think of India as a very poor nation, and it is, but it's also one of the great emerging nations that is trying to leapfrog from third world status to first world status, and in part they're doing that very, very well. In some other areas there are some problems, and the most important problem, and you will see this as we go in our excursions, particularly in the hinterland of our cities, is the incredible inequality. It's one of the greatest inequalities in the world, with average GDP, gross domestic product per person, of only $6,000. That's incredible when you see that there is so much concentrated wealth in India, that there is still this incredible poverty, which puts India in 124th place in the world. And yet it is also armed to the teeth. It is the third largest army in the world. And it has nuclear weapons, as we know, because Pakistan, its rival, also has nuclear weapons. And as of last year, it is the largest arms buyer in the world. That's not very good, folks. They spend a lot of their capital not on caring for the poor, but on buying arms. Now, much of that, I must admit, is driven not only by the rivalry with Pakistan, which is largely a land border, but by, of course, the more, shall we say, aggressive stature of China. You know, we are sailing in an area of the world where China and many other nations of Southeast Asia are competing for resources in the South China Sea. And this is definitely a reason why many nations, including India, are bolstering their military might. Climate, well, I don't have to tell you about the climate. All you have to do is go outside and know that we are in a heat wave. Yesterday I read in an article in the New York Times that this is the hottest summer on record, and that we are going through a tremendous heat wave, which is brought on by both climate change as well as El Nino. So both of these forces have produced this incredible heat wave where in Kolkata, the other day it was 43 Celsius, which is about 108 Fahrenheit. Schools were closed. It is hot, and it's going to be hot. And again, that's because of this very rare coincidence of, on the one hand, climate change, which is accelerating, according to some studies, and the other hand, El Nino, who is bringing a lot of hot air and hot ocean into the equation. So up here is, again, in the highlands, it's very nice and cool, particularly up here in the Himalaya area. Then here in the blue area, it's subtropical, and the more you go down, the hotter it gets, until down here we are in true tropical, wet areas. This is not the rainy season, of course, that comes later in the year, but these are the two areas that we're going to be visiting. Kerala, that's right here, and Goa. These are the two places where before, of course, we go up to Mumbai, and those are the two places that we're going to talk about today. India has, of course, for a long time been part of the British Empire, the British Raj, and that's a period on which many people look with some nostalgia. And I'm not going to talk a lot about that because in my lecture on our last Sea Day, before we get to India, I'm going to have a separate lecture on Gandhi and Mother Teresa, and both in the context of the British Raj. So I'm going to save that for that lecture. I think it's Friday morning rather, at 10 o'clock. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the British Empire. And what was that about? How was it governed? How did the people feel under British rule? And again, it's a very diverse picture. There are a lot of good things that the British did, far more than the Portuguese or the Dutch, who were here as well. But of course, there are other aspects to that rule that were less positive. So we're going to try to create a very fair picture of British rule in India, which had such a tremendous impact on the country today. One of the things they did was build a lot of stuff, which we've seen already in Malaysia and Myanmar. And here we have this stupendous palace. Unfortunately, we're not going to see it on this trip. It's in Delhi. It was originally the British Viceroy house, the governor, built in 1829. In fact, it took about 9 years to build. And today it's the residence of the President of India, who is sort of more of a ceremonial figure. The real power is in the hands of the Prime Minister. But the real power, indeed, is here in Parliament. Right here you see President Obama addressing Parliament during his recent visit to India. Again, a very British-styled building from neo-18th century Baroque. Beautiful, beautiful Parliament building there. And today, India is still struggling with not only economic equality, but also with strife. Passions, nationalist passions, tensions between Muslims and Hindus are once again flaring up, and it is a real problem. The other day, a Muslim man was lynched by a mob because rumor went that he had eaten a cow. We're going to talk about that in a minute. The man had never even done that. But just the rumor that he had eaten a cow, which is a sacred animal in India, was enough for the mob to lynch him. And these are real issues that India must face. The other source of tension is, of course, Kashmir. Kashmir is a state, a province in between Pakistan and India. It was a princely state which was late in contributing, or at least deciding which side it was going to go with in 1948 when independent India was negotiated. Again, we'll talk about that on Friday. And ever since, it's been a bone of contention between both states, India and Pakistan. And of course, there are territorial disputes with China. Now, just about a year and a half ago, as you've been following the news, you probably saw that the leading Congress party, which was always held by the Gandhi dynasty, was toppled. And for the first time, we had the Bharatiya Janata Party, or BJP as they're called, come to power, which was a landslide in Indian politics. And the man who achieved power at that time is right there on the right top, Narendra Modi. And there is tremendous pressure on this guy. Real pressure on this man to do away, first of all, with corruption. Corruption is a tremendous scourge in India. I saw the other day an estimate that just in the construction and telecommunications sectors, the state has lost about $70 billion in taxes and other proceeds because it's going into the pockets of various officials, high and low. One thing they're trying to do is there is an independent entrepreneur in India who is building an internet site where people can do most of their civic tasks, such as applying for a passport or filing their taxes, online, which is a very new model for India. Because if you do that, there is no middleman, there is no official who is going to line his pockets, who is going to demand a cut on whatever it is that you want to do. So there's hope that through technology we can start to deal with the tremendous corruption in India, but it's a real problem. The other challenge that Modi is facing is that the Bharatiya Janata Party, or BJP, has a very militant right-wing Hindu faction. And they are steering his government to the right. And they are fomenting a lot of the tension in the country, particularly versus Muslims. And that's a bad thing. We see that in other parts of the world too, the sort of polarization of left and right. It's almost a theme of the second decade of the 21st century, a polarization. We see it in other parts of the world. And particularly in India, that has very important ramifications because it's only by sheer strength of goodwill that these many diverse parties can live together in peace. This is an interesting map I found. This shows you the concentration of India's population, 1.2 billion people, can you imagine? And you can see that by and large, of course, they are located here in Calcutta. This is the great Ganges Delta. And this, of course, is that very fertile agricultural hinterland up here, and areas where we're going to go. Mumbai, right here, and Kerala and Goa. So these are some of the most... In between is this vast rural area where a lot of the poor live. India's population, as I said earlier, is expected to bypass China because it's growing at a rate of 17%. Can you imagine that? An incredible growth rate that is very difficult to manage, of which 25% of those 1.2 billion live below the poverty line, the official poverty line, which the World Bank has set at $1.25. I don't know how you could live on $1.25, but in India, you can barely make do. 15% of 1.2 billion people is officially malnourished. Tremendous challenges that this country is facing. What's more, 70% lives in rural areas, and that has really result in the fact that only 65% of women are literate. Only 82% of men are literate. Worse, because of the conditions in these inner states, which are very much independently administered, many of these poor live as virtual serfs, as peasants, under the thumb and rule of local chieftains. Almost medieval conditions. So these are really, before we talk about culture and all the wonderful things we're going to see, I wanted to just tell you a little bit about the country we're going to visit, which they're really facing some tremendous challenges that they need to cope with. 22 official languages. Fortunately, because of course, the British history, and because English is taught in primary, secondary school throughout India, you should be able to communicate with people that you meet in English fairly well, in shops and taxi drivers and so forth. It is, as one author has said, a nation of religion. It's not a religious nation, it's a nation of religion. And remember what I mentioned when we were sailing to Myanmar, is that in our world, religion and work and family are largely separated. We say our grace at dinner, we go to church or synagogue, but when we work, when we meet with friends, religion is not necessarily there on the forefront of our activity. In India, that is not the case. Everything people do, everything that people think, say, is governed by their Hindu identity. And so you cannot understand India unless we know a little bit about what Hinduism is about. And you can see once again that it's the core of the nation that is overwhelmingly Hindu. Muslims, of course, are close to Pakistan, as well as here. We have some Christian areas right here, and Kerala. It's not on this map for some reason, but Kerala is also very well known for its Christian population. And then, of course, Buddhists, which only form a very small part of the area, which is kind of funny because it is in India that Buddhism was born. In fact, there are 4 religions that were born right here in India: Buddhism, Jainism, Hinduism, and Sikhism. And yet, when you look at the percentages, Hinduism is by far the largest religion, by almost 80%, followed by Islam at 14%, Christianity still 2% of 1.2 billion, that's still a fair amount of people, Sikhism 1.7, and then Buddhism at 0.0. Imagine that. It almost reminds me of Christianity, which started as a Jewish reform movement in Galilee, in Roman Palestine, and left its cradle to grow, of course, in the Roman Empire. Something similar we see here, but Buddhism was born in India and yet has its greatest manifestation in places like Thailand, Vietnam, and Myanmar. Amazing, isn't it? How the world turns. And of course, there are very small percentages, Baha'i Judaism and Jainism. We'll talk about it in a minute. And here again, you can see that the concentration of Hinduism is again in these rural areas away from the great metropolitan areas. Of course, this is the bedrock of support for Modi. This is where that's where he finds his greatest support. And this is, of course, also where the greatest tensions are between the various different faiths. So he is very leery to intervene in that because his very support is in the right-wing nationalist wing of the BHP party. A little bit about history. I know you guys are on vacation. I know that. But we need to know a little bit about the history so that when your guide refers to various things, you know what we're talking about, right? So it all begins, some say, in 1600 BC when the Aryans from the Caspian Sea, those pesky Aryans, they went out and conquered the world, as some historians believe. But we have considerable archaeological evidence, not a lot, that suggests that before this critical time date of 1600 BC, which is when most people, your guide probably as well, dates the beginning of India. Before that, there were probably some proto-civilizations as well. From the Aryan experience come the Vedas, and if you saw Carol's outstanding lecture yesterday, right here, she played some beautiful Vedic chants. This is the time of the wisdom literature of the Vedas, which are driven, as we will see, by a lot of the animism that animated the country at that time. The next important thing, of course, is the age of Buddha. Now, don't pin me down on these dates, because these dates are, of course, approximate, but it's about, the 6th and 5th century BC is when we think the Gautama lived and Buddhism began to spread. The next major leap is Alexander the Great. Yes, he came in, saw, turned around, and left, but he did leave a what we call Hellenistic, Greek-inspired imprint on the nation, which had an almost immediate impact on Indian art, as we will see. The sheer realism, the naturalism, the mastery of human form in marble and stone astonished Indian sculptors and artists. They had never seen anything like it. And so you see right after the age of Alexander a tremendous influx of realism, anatomical realism, naturalism entering the realm of Indian art. Then comes somewhere between the 320, 330 AD, the Gupta dynasty. And you will have your guide refer to that a lot. The Gupta is when Hinduism basically becomes the dominant religion of India. It's a gradual process. Again, syncretism, which means that multiple religious influences produce something very unique that you don't see anywhere else. That's a very expensive word for a very simple explanation, syncretism. But the Gupta dynasty is the dynasty that begins to formulate the paradigm of the Hindu temple. And you guys are going to see a lot of Hindu temples. So in a minute, I'll show you what a typical Hindu temple looks like so that you can recognize it for yourself and explore it for yourself. This is when these temples are basically beginning to emerge. Then comes the first great Muslim era. We've had that in India. In fact, in the British Museum, for those of you who are in the UK, we have a lot of British people here. I was just in London a few months ago, and the British Museum now has a wonderful exhibit dedicated to the great Islamic Sultanate in India. Beautiful sculptures currently on exhibit. That lasts till about 1526, of course. We all know what happens then. The Mughal dynasty, the great flowering of Indian culture. You will have your guide refer to the Mughal many, many times. That is the great moment of pride before the foreigners move in. So Mughal is the great flowering of Indian independent culture before these Europeans move in. The Portuguese, we're going to see that in Goa. And then, of course, the East India Company. I'll talk to you a little bit about the East India Company tomorrow when we're going to talk about naval technology. Before we, of course, go to Goa and Mumbai, I'm going to share a little bit with you about the unique naval technology that allowed these Europeans to travel so far. And then, of course, India becomes part of the British Crown, 1858, and independent in 1948. Well, there you have it. That wasn't so hard, was it? That wasn't so painful. But that's sort of the key dates that will bracket your visit. There is a caste system in India. I don't have time to belabor it. It basically was grounded in the ancient system, almost reaching back to the time of the Vedas, of at the top of the social class system, you had the Brahmins, the priesthood, then came the warriors, the tradesmen, the merchants, the free farmers, and then a big red line, the Dalits or untouchables. These are peasants, serfs, slaves. And over time, of course, these economic distinctions have fallen away, but the same sense of class is still very much prevalent in India today. And the reason is, and this I must really point to is because the British basically categorized it as part of the legal system. When the British came in after the when India became part of the British Empire rather than the East India Company, in order to sort of organize the recruitment of officials in the bureaucracy, the British law, the British Crown, institutionalized the caste system so that they could basically have a pecking order as to which person could fit in what part of their administrative system, and that's when the caste system became ingrained, if you will, into the nation. Today, Gandhi tried very much to fight that. He was proud to live with Dalits. For example, in Delhi, he would live with untouchables, which was unthinkable, you know, and he forced people who visited him to come to a neighborhood of untouchables. But today it is still a major problem. Under Indian law, you cannot discriminate based on caste, but of course in practice we all know what really is happening. Now, Hinduism came about as a result of the polytheism of the ancient times. This was a time, and I mentioned this earlier, when people really believed in spirits, and even today people believe in spirits. There are good spirits, there are bad spirits. They can lurk under a rock, they can be in a tree, they can be in the corner of your house, but you must pacify them, you must pay homage to them, because it's spirits that govern what happens, okay? Now, temporarily, that animism was repressed as Buddhism grew, and Buddhism is a much more intellectual movement, as we saw earlier. Buddhism is about personal self-actualization. It's about achieving enlightenment. And that Buddhism curve lasted for about a few hundred years until, as we saw, under the Guptas, the Hinduism, the original polytheistic Sturm und Drang came about, and people fell back on this more, well, I don't want to say primitive, but how about more indigenous way of dealing with nature and supernatural phenomena. And that's when you see really a very syncretic embrace of a multitude of gods. That's uniquely Indian, but then still some of the old elements of Buddhism, such as leadership of a priesthood, the belief in reincarnation, which is very, very strong in Hinduism, the constant cycle of birth and death, and, of course, the idea that there are multiple gods. So all of these elements of previous traditions in India basically came together to forge this unique thing called Hinduism. Now, I know for our Western eyes, some of these pictures are a little bizarre, right? We can look at this and say, what the heck is that? But there is a symbolism here. For example, Hindu gods are supernatural. They're like Batman. You know, these are supernatural super people. And you see that because, for example, they have multiple faces because they have far more knowledge than we as human beings have. They have multiple arms and legs because they have far more power than normal human beings have, right? And they have multiple eyes because they can see a lot more than we mortals can. You see what I'm saying? So it's a very simple way of expressing the incredible strength and powers that these Hindu gods have. Now, there are thousands of Hindu gods, local gods, large national gods, but the most important ones for you to remember, and your guide will refer to that, is the Hindu Triad, or the Trimurti. And there's three gods here that really count. One, of course, is Brahma. He's like Zeus. He's the father god, the creator. But he doesn't really figure in worship all that much. He's more of a titular head, like a president, like a chairman of the board, if you will. The two gods that really matter in your life, good and evil, are Vishnu. He's the good one. He's everything that is good about people. He's the god of love, of preservation, of goodness. And of course, against him is the god of evil, Shiva, the destroyer, the god of death and life, even though there are some good aspects to Shiva. But it's between this conflict of Vishnu and Shiva that the whole pantheon of Hindu experience is built. Not unlike Christianity, we have God and devil. Not unlike other great religions in the world, such as Islam, the same thing happens there. Satan and Allah. So it's, again, very basic and very recognizable to us. This is Brahma. You can see he's a superior god with multiple faces, his great wisdom. Here is Vishnu, a very, very attractive, very welcoming, warm god of love. And here, of course, is the evil Shiva. We've all seen this sculpture, right? He's dancing, plotting all kinds of evil things. It's a wonderfully figurative religion. It's an expressive religion that you will see. Now, the other thing is, in Hinduism, there is hardly any distinction between human beings and animals. There is no boundary. So, gods can have a human torso and a head of an animal, such as, of course, the famous Ganesha, the son of Shiva, who has the head of an elephant, and a very popular god, Hanuman. Hanuman has the face of a monkey. Again, because they basically move back and forth between the realm of animals and human beings, they have tremendous powers. Indian scripture is important too, of course. The Mahabharata, I'm sure you've heard about that, is the corpus of Indian scripture, as well as the Bhagavad Gita, which is something that Gandhi always cited from. We'll talk a little bit more about it on Friday. Beautiful sermon. And the Ramayana, great love story. And it's so typical for me as a historian to see that the great corpus of common knowledge that built our civilizations, Hebrew scripture, the Iliad, the Ramayana, these are all stories. It's amazing, isn't it? These are stories of people that we can identify with. And the reason is, I think, because stories appeal to both parts of our brain. They appeal to our cognitive part, but they also appeal to our emotional faculties, because we want to root for heroes. We want to identify with heroes. I think that's why, through thousands of years of history, important information about a tribe, about a nation, was transmitted in the form of stories that were told around the campfire. So Hindu life is a wonderfully joyous and very expressive form, and you'll hopefully will see that as we go through India. So the Hindu temple, you'll see many of these. It's basically made up of three components. You always have an entrance tower like this, a portal, which is sort of in the form of a pyramid, multi-tiered. Every tier belongs to a particular group of gods. And then comes an inner hall, a hall of preparation, which is called the mandapa, followed by the inner sanctuary proper, the garbhagriha, the womb chamber. Here is a little floor plan I drew. So if you keep this in your mind, this is basically every temple that you will see. And not very unlike, and perhaps this is part of the influence of Alexander the Great, not unlike Greek temples. You know, you have a portal, a pronaos, and a naos. Very, very similar to the typical temple structure that emerged at the same time all over the world. So the mandapa, which is this courtyard type area where you sort of prepare yourself, and then finally here the garbhagriha, which is the Holy of Holies, where you actually perform your sacrifice, and around it is a circulatory, often with colonnades, where you can buy things, for example, to offer to the various gods. Well, we are going here to Kochi and up to Mangalore. These are our two destinations here. First, I want to show you Kollam. Kollam is where we had this terrible temple fire. Remember that? Did you read about that? The day before we embarked, there was a terrible temple fire because they were playing with fireworks. Fireworks were forbidden, but as part of the New Year celebrations, this whole temple structure was laid waste. That was all happening here in Kollam. But we're going to Kochi, which Cochin, beautiful part, beautiful harbor, first founded by the Portuguese in 1500, who came here, and the main trade center of the province of Kerala, which is Hindu and Christian, with a population of some $2 million. Very high literacy here. This is what it appeared like in the early Portuguese days. And of course, this is where, when this beautiful church was built, you will see this church, the St. Francis Church, the oldest church, Christian church in India, built in 1503. You can see with already a sort of a Jesuit swing to it and the beautiful facade. Also, a gorgeous synagogue. If you choose that particular excursion, they're going to take you to the synagogue, although I believe it will be closed since it is a Friday. It's the oldest synagogue in India, built in 1344 by the so-called Paradesi Jews. There are two types of Jews who lived here. On the one hand, the Paradesi, the white Jews as they're called, or the Malabari or black Jews. And the Malabari Jews believed, or at least believed, that they were descendant from the Jews who came here in the time of King Solomon. Of course, we're talking 900 BC. Historians are not quite certain that that truly happened, but it is definitely true that as early as the 1st century AD, there is evidence of a large Jewish community here. There are very few people left. Before World War II, there were about 2,500 Jews, but there's only a few families left. But we have a very nice excursion to that area, including the famous Coder House, which is part of the Jewish quarter. Lots of cathedrals, of course, thanks to the Portuguese. This is the Santa Cruz Cathedral. We'll see a lot more of Portuguese in my next lecture tomorrow when I'm going to talk about Goa, which, did you know that Goa was part of Portugal until 1961? Not many people know that. It was a little enclave of Portugal in the middle of the Republic of India until 1961, when it was taken by force by India. And of course, the Portuguese could do very little about it. And also something that you're going to see are these beautiful fishing nets, these Chinese fishing nets around the city. Mangalore is an entirely different story. There's this beautiful Shiva statue. We all know who Shiva is, right? Yes. And the god of evil. And we're going to see that right off the shore. Mangalore is known primarily as Mangaluru, dedicated to the god Mangaladevi. There's a little statue of him right there. And we think, some historians think, that as early as the 1st century, the time of Pliny the Elder, a major geographer who witnessed the explosion of the Vesuvius in Pompeii, and the historian Ptolemy knew about it and called it Nitra. Of course, this is a very controversial subject. We're not going to go into there. But maybe it's true that the town was known that early. It is the port of the state of Karnataka, and it is a very clean city. And the reason why it's so clean is because Modi has designated 100 cities in India as cities in which he's going to invest a lot, because he wants these cities to become model cities of the new India. Very high-tech, Wi-Fi on every corner, terrific education, terrific civic services, no corruption. So these model cities, Mangalore is going to be one of them. It's a really nice, beautiful place. It has still some remnants of the wars between the sultans and the British as they tried to take over the country. Here's the Gokarnath Temple, which you will visit. But many of you, as I said, are also going here to this region and visit the 1,000-pillar temple in Karkala. And so I must end my lecture today with a little bit about Jainism, because you cannot really understand Jainism. You cannot really understand these temples. Know a little bit about. And Jainism is in some way very similar to Buddhism, except a lot more extreme. Okay, these are people who believe that the soul, or the jiva, is perfect, the body is not. And the soul is locked in this constant cycle of birth and death, of reincarnation, and we need to get out of there. Well, the Buddhists feel the same way, but the Buddhist wants to do that through cumulative enlightenment. No The Jaina says, no, it can only be overcome by a complete rejection of anything physical. So Jainists are vegetarians, very strict vegetarians. They're very austere. They don't hurt a fly. Literally, if you see a wasp or a mosquito in your house, you're supposed to basically guide it out of your house. You cannot hit it with a newspaper roll. These people are lovely people, but very, very extreme, of course. And their focal point is a swastika. I'm sorry to say it. I mean, for many of us, it is a horrific symbol, quite clearly. And it was chosen by Hitler precisely because it is associated with these early Aryan civilizations that spread over India and the Near East in 1600 BC, precisely for that association. But for the Jainas, the swastika incorporates the 4 places where the soul can be reborn. So when you see this symbol, it's not because we have some neo-Nazis in India. Of course, there may be, I don't know. But because it is a very important symbol. In fact, all the temples, all the Jain temples, have a swastika, and a ceremony typically begins and ends with priests forming a swastika on the altar as a very ancient symbol of Indian culture. You're going to see this, if you go to Karkala, you're going to see this incredible sculpture. It is a statue of Lord Bahubali, who stood for a year, talk about austerity, right? For a year he stood to try to achieve that incredible knowledge that would allow him to break out of their cycle of reincarnation. And he stood for a year without moving, so much that the vines crawled around his legs. And there are many of these incredible monolithic sculptures throughout India, but this is the second largest one, and this is how Bahubali achieved moksha and was liberated from the cycle of reincarnation. Now, every 12 years, Jains from all over the country and the world come here, and they basically venerate this sculpture by pouring milk and saffron paste over it. And they do it every 12 years, and the last time was just a few months ago, in January of 2016. There's also this beautiful Manjunatha Temple, which to me symbolizes really what India is. It's a syncretic temple where Buddhism and Hinduism come together, and in this case to worship Lord Shiva through various things. So I hope I've given you a little bit. It was very quick, but I hope to have given you a little bit of a taste of the tremendous complexity that is India. Thank you very much. Thank you.